Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are on the Libaas wa Zeena, and this next chapter which we are taking, that it is permissible for a man to wear silk because of some itch he has or some other pressing need. From Anas ibn Malik, he reports that the Prophet ﷺ granted a concession to Abdurrahman ibn Auf and to Az-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam to wear a silk shirt on a journey they were, because of some itch that they were both experiencing. This narration tells us that you are allowed to wear silk as a man, subject to the condition. But what is the condition? Is it because of an itch you are experiencing? Or is it because of an itch on a journey? Because the narration specifically mentions a journey. So we have to know what the illah is, what the justification is. And we find that the better opinion is that the journey does not make a difference. Rather, as long as you have the pressing need, like an itch or some other ailment, which a silk clothing can relieve you of, then you're allowed to wear silk even if you are resident in your home. And that this description of the journey is irrelevant to the ruling at hand. And this narration shows that sometimes the ulama have to look at the proper illah or the proper reason for the ruling, and that there could be some other reasons which do not pertain to the ruling. They are just some extra descriptions. So we say in any pressing valid need, men are allowed to wear silk. The need may be because of an itch or some other pressing need. The next chapter, wearing clothing dyed with usfur. From Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, he says that the Prophet saw me wearing two clothing which were dyed in safflower, and the Prophet told me, "Inna hadhihi min thiyab al-kuffar fala talbasha." These are the clothing of the kuffar, so do not wear it. Also, in another narration, again from Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, he says that the Prophet saw me with two clothing dyed with safflower, and he said to me, "Ummuka amaratka bihadha?" Did your mother order you to do this? Meaning to wear clothing dyed with saffron. He says, I said, "Aghsiluha," I will wash it, meaning wash the dye away. And the Prophet said, "Bal ahriqha." No, rather you should burn it. First of all, this usfur is the safflower, and clothes dyed with safflower are red in color. The Prophet said in the first narration that these are from the kuffar's clothing, so do not wear them, because the Muslim distinguishes himself from the kuffar, meaning the emblem of the kuffar. Because if you imitate a people outwardly, imitation here means in that which is specific to them. So if you imitate them outwardly in that which is specific to them, then it will lead to internal imitation in terms of your beliefs and convictions and whom you love and hate. So the outward has an effect on the inward. So it's simply no good saying, "Yes, but my heart is filled with Iman, even if I am imitating the kuffar." Because it is now, but soon it will not be. Because you are not two different people, you are one and the same person. Which means the outward has an effect and is joined and is linked on to the inner. You are one being. In the second narration, we find that he asks Abdullah ibn Amr, "Did your mother order you to do this?" And then he says, "I will wash it." The Prophet said, "No, burn it." One might ask, why is the Prophet ordering Abdullah ibn Amr to destroy wealth? And the answer is because in so doing there is a greater benefit. It will reinforce the rule not to wear such clothing, and it will have much more of an impact on Abdullah ibn Amr. And we can take from this that it is permissible for the Khalifa to impose financial penalty on a person, that which will take his wealth away from him. Similarly, how the Prophet ordered that the one who committed ghulul, stealing from the war booty, that his luggage be burnt as a punishment, so that the ruling can be more emphatic on the perpetrator. Note two types of dyes. We have the safflower, which in Arabic is usfur, and this gives a red color. And then we have saffron, in Arabic za'afran, which produces a yellow color. And both of them are impermissible for men, but permissible for women. We have a narration also that the Prophet wore a hulla, which is the izar and rida, of red color. And so some people say that red clothing for men is halal. But we say that yes, it was a red hulla, but it had other colors mixed in with it as well. So it was not purely red, and this is how we may reconcile the narrations. So men are allowed to wear clothing which has red color in it, but not purely red. Za'afran, or saffron, producing the yellow color, is not just a dye, but it is also a perfume, and hence the muhrim is not allowed to wear it because it is a perfume as well. But outside the ihram, you cannot wear clothing dyed with za'afran because the Prophet forbade this. So both za'afran, saffron, and the usfur, safflower, which produces the red color, both are impermissible for men. However, it's worth noting that if we say that the ullah, the justification for the mu'asfar, is that it is from the clothing of the kuffar, then if we are living in a different time, in which case the mu'asfar clothing from safflower is not specifically the clothing of the kuffar, then the ullah is no longer present, and the ruling therefore will no longer be present. Let's take the next chapter, the virtue of wearing the hibara. Anas ibn Malik was asked, which item of clothing was most beloved to the Prophet? And Anas replied, al-hibara. The hibara is clothing from cotton and it is adorned. And we say that this is not some sort of sunnah to wear the hibara, but rather matters of clothing and medicine and food. Normally, these are down to the customs of the people. So the Prophet liked it most because this was the best clothing in that time and place. It's not like this clothing has any shari'i significance to it. It was simply the Prophet's taste. So we now cannot say it is legislated in the Sharia to wear the hibara, in the same way that we can say it is legislated in the Sharia to use the miswak. Let's move to the next chapter, about modesty in dress and wearing coarse or rough clothing. Abu Burda reports that he entered the house of Aisha and she brought out for us, he says, a rough izar, meaning the izar made of rough fabric, which was made in Yemen, and also a mantle which they would call al-mulabbadah. And Aisha swore by Allah that the Prophet died in these two items of clothing. Again, this mulabbadah clothing is a rough clothing, meaning a rough fabric. So we're not talking about luxury item of clothing. Now it's worth noting that when the Prophet died, as reported in Sunan Abi Dawud authentically, the Sahaba were in doubt, should we take the clothes of the Prophet off, like we do with the other deceased? And then they fell to slumber, and in their sleep somebody spoke to them, telling them to wash the Prophet with his clothes on. So it appears that the Prophet's clothing after he died were not taken off. If that is the case, then these items of clothing, this coarse izar and the mulabbadah, the other coarse Yemeni clothing, could not have been the clothing that the Prophet died in. Rather, we would understand it to be that the Prophet died in these types of clothing, not this actual clothing per se. So what is referred to here in the narration is the type of clothing, not the actual clothing per se, and Allah knows best. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that the Prophet went out one morning with a mantle on him made of black hair with patterns of camel saddles on it. We can take from this narration at least 2 points. Number one, that black colour is allowed to be worn. Not that we need evidence for that, but here it is anyway. And secondly, that you're allowed to wear clothing with patterns on it, even with pictures on it, as long as they are not faces of humans and animals. Again, we do not need evidence for this because the asl is, or the default rule is, that this is all halal anyway, but we have positive evidence anyway. And the third narration in the chapter, again from Aisha. She says that the pillow on which the Prophet would recline was made of leather stuffed with palm fiber. So what do all of these narrations, 3 of them in total, have in common? They have one common thread, which is modesty in clothing, as opposed to the extravagance that is fashionable these days. And it is only narrations like these that can make you break away from the misguided mold of society. The next chapter, about the permissibility of using carpets or mats or rugs. Jabir reports that when I was married, the Prophet asked me if I had a namat, which is a carpet or a rug. And Jabir said, Anna lana al-mat. How on earth could we possibly have rugs or carpets? We are not that rich. Whereupon the Prophet said, Ama innaha satakun. You shall soon possess them. In this narration there is a prediction from the Prophet that the Muslims will become rich and that they will be able to afford these carpets and rugs and mats and these types of luxury items. And indeed that is what happened with the many conquests after the time of the Prophet. The next chapter, about keeping more than that which is necessary from your bedding or your clothing. From Jabir ibn Abdullah, the Prophet said, فراش للرجل وفراش لامرأته والثالث للضيف والرابع للشيطان. A bedding for the man, a bedding for his wife, the third for the guest, and the fourth for shaitan. This hadith is clear in its meaning. Any wealth which is unnecessary is extravagance, and it is from the ways of the shaitan. Rather, you take what you need. As for who defines what a need is, well, this varies from time to time and place to place, but your sound judgment needs to be used here. Purchasing unnecessary items which do not serve a valid and useful purpose is extravagance. What you find with many rich people is that they purchase many different commodities as an ostentatious show of their wealth, and this is an action that ought to be rebuked. The next chapter about dragging your clothing out of pride. From Ibn Umar, the Prophet said, لا ينظر الله إلى من جر ثوبه خيلا. Allah will not look at a person who drags his clothing out of self-conceit. When he says he will not look at such a person, it means the look of mercy, not the look of anger. Otherwise, Allah Jalla wa Ala looks at, or you could say sees, all things. As for the word thawb, clothing, it can mean any clothing, be it trousers, izar, shirt, cloak, even the amama, the turban. One might ask, but what if somebody does not do it out of pride? Well, if somebody still does it intentionally, not out of pride, then the authentic hadith in al-Bukhari, إِنَّمَا أَسْفَلَ مِنَ الْكَعْبَيْنِ فَفِي النَّارِ. Whatever is beneath the ankle bones is in the fire. But it means that it is still haram, although it is less haram than dragging it out of self-conceit, because the punishment is worse. Out of self-conceit, Allah will not look at you, and that is worse than whatever is beneath the two ankle bones is in the fire. As for if somebody's clothing drags beneath the ankles unintentionally, then he is not blameworthy. Actually, we can add to this punishment. Earlier in the book of Sahih Muslim, we have the authentic hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, ثلاثة لا يكلمهم الله يوم القيامة ولا ينظر إليهم ولا يزكيهم ولهم عذاب أليم. 3 people Allah will not talk to on Yawm al-Qiyamah, nor will look at, nor will purify them of their sins, and they will have a painful torment. And they said, خابوا وخسروا. Such people have been lost and completely fallen. Who are they, O Messenger of Allah? And he said, المسبل والمنان والمنفق سلعته بالحلف الكاذب. The musbil, the one who drags his clothing below the ankles on the ground, and the mannan, the one who reminds people of the favors he has given them, and the one who sells his merchandise by taking a lying oath. So we find that Allah Jalla wa Ala will not even speak to such people, nor will purify them of their sins. And again, speaking here means the speech of mercy, not the speech of anger and rebuke, because that he will do with the kuffar and the evildoers. So if you have your clothing beneath the ankle, intentionally but not out of pride, then anything below the ankle will be in Jahannam. That will be similar to the hadith, وَيْلٌ لِلْأَعْقَابِ مِنَ النَّارِ. Destruction to the heels from the fire. And the context of that hadith is that people were not washing their heels during the wudu, and the Prophet gave this warning, that such heels will be punished in the fire. So all of you will not be punished in the fire, but just that part of your body. Also in the chapter, from Ibn Umar, he says, I passed by the Prophet with my lower garments trailing on the ground, and the Prophet said to him to tuck up your garments. I tugged it up, and the Prophet said, tug it up further. I tugged it up, and he kept repeating this command till I said, ila ain, up till where? And the Prophet said, ansaf as-saqain, halfway up your shin. This narration gives us the limit. So you do not raise your clothing above halfway up your shin. So that's the upper limit. And then we have the lower limit. You do not lower your clothing to beneath the ankle bone. So anything between these two limits is the sunnah. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says that it's not just trailing your clothing on the ground. Rather, it could be any part of the clothing. For example, you could wear clothing with very long sleeves, more than that which is customary, or very extravagant turban. Anything which exceeds what is customarily acceptable is forbidden, because it becomes a thawb al-shuhra, a type of clothing by which you become known or become famous. And the hadith is that anyone who wears such a clothing, then Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah will clothe him with a clothing of humiliation. The next chapter, about walking with pride and being pleased with your clothing. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, بينما رجل يمشي قد أعجبته جمته وبرداه إذ خسف به الأرض فهو يتجلجل في الأرض حتى تقوم الساعة. Whilst a man was walking, being well pleased with his long hair, and both his mantles, the earth swallowed him up, and he would go on sinking in the earth until Yawm al-Qiyamah. The poetic justice in this hadith is that this man is walking on the earth full of pride and being pleased with his hair and his clothing, and so as he walks on the earth with pride, he is swallowed up by the earth, so punished by the earth, as if the earth is telling him, what gave you the right to walk on me with self-conceit? The question is the Prophet simply giving us an information, some knowledge of what happened in the past, and that's it? The answer is no. He's telling us this so that we may take lesson and not make the same mistakes as others have made before us. That is the whole point about Allah Jalla wa Ala giving us stories in the Quran, so that we may take admonition. The next chapter, about the gold ring for men. Abdullah ibn Abbas reports, the Prophet saw a gold ring in a man's hand. He pulled it off and threw it away, saying, يَعْمِدُ أَحَدُكُمْ إِلَى جَمْرَةٍ مِّن نَارٍ فَيَجْعَلُهَا فِي يَدِهِ. One of you goes to a coal from the fire of Jahannam and puts it on his hand. Then when the Prophet went away, the man who was wearing the ring was told, take your ring and make use of it. And the man said, no, by Allah, I will never take what the Messenger of Allah threw away. In this narration, there is clear-cut evidence that it is impermissible to wear a gold ring. Again, the narration is general, but like we've said before, we have textual evidence which makes an exception for women. We find here the Prophet changes the evil using his hand physically, and this can be done if you have authority, but not if you do not have authority, because that could then lead to more fitna. We also take from the narration the extreme veneration this man, who is unnamed in the narration, had for the Prophet, that he would not even pick up what the Prophet himself threw away. Truly the Prophet ﷺ was the most venerated man in the history of mankind. There will be no one else like him, and this is only because of the barakah of Allah Jalla wa Ala on the Prophet. Okay, here's a question. What if a man says that I want to wear this gold ring because I fear that if I leave it away from me, it might get stolen? We say, no, this is not a valid excuse. Why? Because the harm caused by your ring being stolen is not a certain harm, because there's a chance it may not get stolen, whereas the corruption caused by your wearing the gold ring is a certainty, that corruption of course being the disobedience of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And when we have a situation where a certainty clashes with a non-certainty, then we give precedence to the certainty, and this is a general principle. And then besides, it could even get stolen from you. If you are wearing it, somebody may pull a knife in front of you and demand that you give him this ring. We find in this narration the Prophet physically took off the ring and threw it away. We also have a narration where Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman physically took off somebody's tamima, that is an amulet which he was wearing, and threw it away and admonished him. So this is physically changing the evil to good. Can we do the same thing then? Physically removing somebody's gold ring or amulet if they're wearing one, and use the evidence of the Prophet and of Hudhayfa and no doubt many other evidence to this effect? Well, we say no, because people like the Prophet or Hudhayfa during their times had authority. People looked up to them and submitted to their opinions. And so we say only people in authority are allowed to take physical action. As for if you're not in such a condition, meaning to say this condition of being in a state of authority, and this will apply to most people, then we say call them with that which is best, and call them with wisdom and a goodly preaching. If you're going to make something haram, give them a halal alternative, and speak to them in ways that will not offend them, but rather in ways that will make them understand. So that is to say, on their level. If somebody wears a gold teeth because his first teeth has been broken as a replacement, then this is fine, because gold will not rot away. And this is similar to what happened in a narration reported in Sunan Abi Dawud, where a Sahabi lost his nose and the Prophet replaced it with a silver one, but it rotted, and so he replaced it with a gold one. However, we say it is a better idea if you're able to replace it with a non-gold tooth, then that ought to be done. And nowadays we feel this should not be too much of a problem. Another narration in the chapter, Abdullah reports that the Prophet took a ring made of gold, and the stone part of the ring he kept it towards the palm. And so the people copied him in that. And so one day what happened, the Prophet was on the minbar, and he took off his gold ring in front of the people and threw it away. And he said to them, Wallahi la albasuhu abada. By Allah, I will never wear it. And so the people copied his example and took their rings off and threw it away. We take from this narration firstly that wearing gold ring was halal, but then it was abrogated. And this principle of abrogation is well known amongst the scholars. The ahkam of the Sharia can be abrogated during the lifetime of the Prophet, never after his life. We can also take from this narration to teach somebody by enacting out the teaching yourself, so physically enacting the teaching, instead of giving verbal instructions. The Prophet would teach his Sahaba in both ways, by enacting the teaching out, such as this time or such as the time when he prayed on the minbar so people could see him praying, or the time when he held up a cup of milk and drank it to break the fast, teaching others to do the same thing as they were on a journey and the fasting became difficult. So he enacted the teaching. Also the time when he shaved his head and sacrificed the animal to release himself from the ihram. This was during the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah. So these are plenty of occasions which give evidence that you can teach by enacting the teaching yourself. And actions do speak louder than words. Also we find from the narration something similar to what we found in the previous narration, the extreme veneration and respect that the Sahaba had for the Prophet. They immediately copied him in throwing away their rings. In the previous narration, the man said that I will not pick up anything that the Prophet has thrown away. So we find this unparalleled love, veneration and devotion that the Sahaba had towards the Prophet. And that of course continues till this day.
Just picking up on a few more points of benefit, the mu'asfar clothing, which is a red dye, is of course haram to be worn, as it is an imitation of the kuffar. And so for men it is haram to wear clothing which is mu'asfar, dyed with usfur, which is a plant, which creates a dye. However, it should be noted that it is permissible for women to wear it, as in the Sunan, there is a version of this hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, أَلَا كَسَوْتَهَا بَعْضَ أَهْلِكَ فَإِنَّهُ لَا بَأْسَ بِهِ لِلنِّسَاءِ. Why do you not give it to some of your womenfolk, because it is halal for them? Okay, then the question becomes, is it haram for men to wear red clothing? As some scholars from this hadith, they took that men are not permitted to wear plain red clothing. Other scholars, like Ash-Shawkani, they say that red clothing is permitted, as we have a narration in the Sahih where the Prophet wore a rida and a nizar, which was of a red color. And he says that what is impermissible is the mu'asfar dye, or even the za'afran dye. But if a clothing is colored red without those two dyes from the plants, then that is okay. Other scholars say that plain red for men is not permitted, regardless of the nature of the dye, and that the narration which says that the Prophet wore the rida and the izar, which was completely red in color, was not actually red in color completely. It had other colors on it as well, but it was predominantly red, and so therefore you can wear clothing which is predominantly red but not plain red. But the opinion of Ash-Shawkani rahimahullah is a respectable one, and one which does agree with the evidence we have at hand. So in that case then, dyeing with red color both your hair and clothing, and wearing red clothing, on that opinion, is permissible for men. Also the statement of the Prophet, أَأُمُّكَ أَمْرَتْكَ بِهَذَا? Did your mother order you to do this? And Nawawi says it's because this mu'asfar clothing would be worn by women.
Let's look at the next chapter about wearing a silver ring in which there was engraved Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, and his Khulafa wore it after him. Ibn Umar reports that the Prophet had for himself a silver ring. Then after him Abu Bakr wore it, and then after him Umar wore it, and then after him it was in Uthman's hand, so he wore it, until this ring fell into the well of Aris, and the words engraved on the ring were Muhammadun Rasulullah. Also in the chapter, Ibn Umar reports that the Prophet had a gold ring, then he discarded it, and took a silver ring, and had these words engraved on it. And the Prophet said, لا ينقش أحد على نقش خاتمي هذا. No one should engrave anything like the engraving of this ring of mine. And he wore it, and this stone side where the engraving was towards the palm of his hand. And this ring fell down the well of Aris from the hands of Mu'ayqib. We take from these narrations that it is permissible to wear a silver ring. The Khulafa wore it after him, so this is evidence that this ruling is not abrogated. The inscription on the ring, Muhammadun Rasulullah, the word Muhammad at the bottom, the word Rasul in the middle, and the word Allah at the top. The reason for this ring with this engraving is that the Prophet would send letters out to the non-Muslims, and he was told that they're not going to read any letter which does not have a stamp on it or a seal. And so this is why he took that ring, so he can use it to seal the letters. We also find the Prophet saying that you should not have this engraving like mine. And this would be similar to saying that no one should have a signature like my signature, because the signature which you use to sign a letter or a document proves that you uniquely are responsible for writing this letter or document or agreeing to a condition. So it makes you unique and separates you from anyone else. So if somebody tries to copy your signature, it means they're involved in some sort of fraud. And so this is similar here. The Prophet says no one should have an engraving like my engraving on the ring, which means you can have a different type of engraving. We find that this ring fell into the well of Aris. It fell from the hands of Mu'ayqib, who was the freed servant of Sa'id ibn Abu al-As. The next chapter about taking a ring when he wanted to write to the non-Arab. From Anas ibn Malik, he says, the Prophet wanted to write to the Rum, these were the people of Europe, and he was told that they will not read a letter which is not sealed by the one who has written it. So that's the equivalent of a signature. So you can have a signature, which is common nowadays, or perhaps a seal or a stamp, which is also quite common nowadays. Anyway, so he says that the Prophet took a ring of silver, and he says, as if I could see its whiteness on the hand of the Prophet, and its engraving was Muhammadun Rasulullah. So we take from this that the Prophet would write to the non-Arab, inviting them to Islam. So you can give da'wah by way of writing as well, literature, letters, books, booklets, and this type of media which you find nowadays. And the means of da'wah is wide and broad. Let's take the next chapter about throwing away the ring. Again from Anas ibn Malik. He says, I saw a silver ring one day on the Prophet, and the people did the same thing, taking the silver ring and they wore it. And then the Prophet threw away his ring, and the people threw it away as well. After having dealt with the hadith that come before this, and now taking a look at this hadith, we see the immediate problem. We find from the previous narration that it was a gold ring that the Prophet threw away, and then the people threw away after him. And in this narration, we are told it was a silver ring. Yet also in the previous narrations, we are told that the Prophet actually took a silver ring because he needed it to write his letters with. And the people took it as well. We are already told that Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman took this silver ring. So the ruling is not abrogated, like we said before. And this narration completely contradicts everything about these rings which we have mentioned in these previous hadith. So we say that this is an example of a shadh narration, an anomalous narration. That is, a narration narrated by a reliable narrator which opposes that which is more reliable than him. The ulama say that the narrator Ibn Shihab has made a mistake here. He should have said that the Prophet threw away the gold ring, not the silver one. The Prophet never threw away the silver ring. Rather, it was continued on even after his lifetime, as we have mentioned. The next chapter about taking a silver ring with a Habashi or Abyssinian stone. From Anas ibn Malik, that the Prophet took a silver ring and its stone was from Abyssinia or Habasha. So we're talking about the signet here of the ring. We also learn in the chapter that the Prophet would wear this ring on his right hand, and the signet would be facing the palm. Now, which hand should you wear the ring in? We have evidence in the Sahihain of both. Some narrations say he wore it in the right, others say in the left. You can wear it either way. The restriction is it must not be worn on the index finger or middle finger. The Prophet forbade Ali radiallahu anh from wearing it like this, and this is also in the Sahih. So you ought to wear the ring either on the little finger or the ring finger. Nothing is mentioned about the thumb, and the asl is that it is allowed to be worn. Otherwise, the recommendation is the little finger or the ring finger. Okay, what about this idea of the signet being towards the palm? Is this obligatory? Well, the Prophet did not give a verbal command. Therefore, we cannot say it is obligatory. Therefore, if you have the signet on top, this is permissible. And if you have the signet on the bottom towards the palm, then this is better, as it is more closely resembling the Prophet's actions. And if you do that with the intention of imitating the Prophet, then you will be rewarded for your intention to imitate. The next chapter about putting the ring on the little finger, which is called the khinsar. Again from Anas ibn Malik, that the Prophet would wear the ring like this, and he indicated to his little finger on his left hand. So we find from this narration that the ring is being worn on the little finger on the left hand, whereas in the previous narration we found that the Prophet wore it in the right hand. So like we say, the matter is flexible. And so likewise, people wearing watches nowadays, of course it ought to be known and clear that gold watches for men are impermissible. Other types of watches are fine, and you can wear a watch on any hand, left or right. The matter is broad, and it's not an act of ibadah. Let us take the next chapter about the forbiddance of wearing the ring on the index finger and the middle finger. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu reports that the Prophet forbade that I should wear my ring in this forefinger or the one next to it, meaning to say the middle finger. And the Prophet also forbade to wear the qassi and also to sit on the mayathir,
which is a saddle cloth.
As regards to the qassi, it is a ribbed garment which was brought from Egypt and from Asham. And as regards to mayathir, then this is something which the women would prepare for their husbands as red cloths for the saddle. So we take from this narration nothing new, except that the ring is not to be worn by men on the forefinger or the index finger. Of course, Ali says that the Prophet forbade him. Well, if he forbids Ali, it is like he forbids the whole of his ummah, because no individual person has special tailor-made rulings for him with regards to the Sharia. The woman can wear rings on any finger. A suggested reason for the prohibition of the index finger and middle finger for the men is that when you're carrying out physical work, then these fingers are more prominent than the other two fingers. As for the qassi, then this is a silk clothing from Egypt or from Asham, and men are not allowed to wear silk. That's the basic principle. As for the mayathir, these are red silk cloths for saddle. So we find you're not allowed to sit on silk either. And we mentioned before, does this apply to women? Because women are allowed to wear silk. Some would say no, it doesn't, because if you're allowed to wear silk, then you can sit on silk as well. The other opinion is that the permission for women is to wear silk. But as for sitting on it, then they are not allowed to do that either, just like men. And Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best. The next chapter about the recommendation of wearing sandals and anything which is like it. Jabir ibn Abdullah says that I heard the Prophet say in one of the expeditions in which we were involved in, the Prophet says, "Istakfiru min al-ni'ali fa-inna ar-rajula la yazalu rakiban man da'ala." Wear sandals much, for a man will be in a state of riding as long as he is wearing sandals. So the hadith is to say that it is as if he is riding an animal. And this hadith would apply in those places where people need to walk much. How is this? Well, sandals will protect your feet from harmful objects in the ground, be it stone or thorns or other than that. And if you're riding an animal, it also protects your feet from the harmful articles on the ground. Definitely this hadith applies to where you have to walk on grounds which may be potentially dangerous or difficult to walk on. So wearing sandals or shoes would make it easier for you to walk, and that is clear-cut, and we can all experience this. Otherwise, we know that in everyday life the Prophet recommended for us not to wear shoes all the time, and that to sometimes walk barefoot, because this is closer to detaching yourself from the luxuries of this world. So sometimes walking bare feet now and then is actually a sunnah. It's a forgotten sunnah, nobody knows about it, but it is a sunnah found authentically in the sunan. Likewise, not combing your hair every day and sometimes leaving them disheveled is also from the sunnah, for the same reason that it is a show of your detachment from the materialistic luxuries of this world. The next chapter about wearing the sandals, or the shoes for that matter, in the right foot first, and taking it off from the left foot first. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, إِذَا انْتَعَلَ أَحَدُكُمْ فَلْيَبْدَأْ بِالْيُمْنَى وَإِذَا خَلَعَ فَلْيَبْدَأْ بِالشِّمَالِ وَلْيُنْعِلْهُمَا جَمِيعًا أَوْ لِيَخْلَعْهُمَا جَمِيعًا. When one of you puts on the shoes, begin with the right, and when one of you takes it off, begin with the left. And either one of you should wear both sandals together, or take them both off together. And so from this narration we find the sunnah of wearing not just shoes, but all types of clothing. You begin with the right, and when you're taking it off, you begin with the left. And this is to do with honoring the right hand side. So what would happen is that you're wearing the clothing on the right hand side for longer. If you begin by wearing it with the right, and you begin by taking it off with the left, so that means the clothing is on the right hand side for longer than the left, and the right is honored over the left. And seeing as though clothing is a good thing from the ni'mah of Allah, so the right hand side enjoys more of it. And we learn also a vital lesson here: do not walk with one shoe on and the other shoe off. Either put both of them on or take both of them off. However, what if you're walking on the street or on the road and one of your shoes breaks or is ripped, such that you cannot wear it anymore? What do we say? Do we say, okay, walk with one shoe and the other one is barefoot? Or do we say, no, the hadith says either take them both off or put them both on. Therefore, if you cannot put the other one on because it's broken, then you take the other one off too and walk barefoot, both feet barefoot. Well, it appears to us, and Allah knows best, that the answer is fear Allah as much as you're able to, and so it is better to walk with at least one foot protected than neither feet protected. And in such a case you will be excused. This would be especially the case if the ground is dangerous, because it has things which could harm your feet. Maybe you're walking on a land which is soft and not dangerous, and it will not harm you to take both shoes off, in which case this is good and closer to following the hadith. And so this idea of putting both shoes on or both shoes off is being just to both of your feet and being balanced, and you'll be able to walk more comfortably when both your feet are the same. Can we make an analogy with this hadith and what women do in wearing bracelets and anklets? If they wear it on one hand and not on the other, or on one ankle and not on the other? It appears that there may well be an analogy here. We say that the reason is that you are just to both sides. And so upon that we would say either wear bracelets on both wrists or on no wrist. Likewise with the anklets. But then somebody might say, what about the ring though? The ring is worn only on one hand, either the right or the left, as we discussed previously. And to this we would say, yes, the normality or the customs is to wear it only on one hand, and the Prophet wore it on one hand, we know that, because this is what is customarily the norm. But that is different then to wearing shoes or anklets or bracelets, in which case it is better to be just and to give both sides the same treatment. Let's take a look at the next chapter, the prohibition of wrapping the garment around you completely and leaving no room for the arm movements, and sitting with a single garment wrapped around one's knees. Jabir reports that the Prophet forbade a man should eat with his left hand or walk with one sandal only, and he forbade the ishtimalus samma, that is to say, a man wraps one garment around himself, leaving no opening for the arms to be drawn out. So he restricts his arms to his body because he has wrapped around himself a garment. This is the ishtimalus samma. And he also forbade al-ihtiba in one clothing. This is a type of sitting where you're sitting on the buttocks and your knees are brought up to you, so close to your chest, and to support you in this position, you wrap a garment around yourself that goes around the knees and all around from your back, so it wraps around you. So if you sit like this, it supports you. Many people would sit like that and wrap their hands around their knees to give them support, but they used to do it by wrapping a clothing around their knees going around their back, so you can leave your hands free like that. Well, this is prohibited because, just as the Prophet said, your awrah could become exposed. But as for if you have, let's say, a sirwal, a thin trouser underneath the izar, and there is no danger that your awra would be exposed, then ihtiba is not prohibited. And it is a popular way of sitting among many people. As for the ishtimal samma, then this is uncomfortable. It restricts your hand movement and it is potentially dangerous. So we derive benefit from the narration that the clothing you wear must be safe and healthy for you and not put you in danger. Likewise, we take from the ihtiba prohibition that you must wear clothing that do not expose your awra or risk your awra being exposed. Many women wear high heels, and this is not a wise idea, not only because of its shari'i prohibition, because it makes noise, but also because of health problems. The high heels put pressure on your bones and can damage your feet that way. This is what we have known from the experts. So just like the ishtimal samma is prohibited, well then wearing high heels on grounds that it is not in your best health interest ought to be even more prohibited, because the ishtimal samma is potentially dangerous and restricts your movements. Well then high heels is even more dangerous than that, because of the pressure it puts on the bones of your feet. And likewise, any other item of clothing which could potentially harm you. Potentially here meaning feasibly harm you. And likewise with the ihtiba, we take that we must be careful not to expose our awra. We find many people, when they are praying, they are wearing short shirts that reach up to about the waist or maybe above the waist. And when they go into the sajda position, it can expose the top of the buttocks. And this is a big problem. This is definitely like the ihtiba fi thawbin wahid, the ihtiba in one clothing which could expose the awra. So from this narration we can take two vital lessons, as you have heard. Let's take the next chapter about the prohibition of lying on your back and putting one foot on top of the other. Again, Jabir reports this, that the Prophet forbade the ishtimal samma and the al-ihtiba fi thawbin wahid, and also thirdly he forbade that a man should lie down on his back and put one foot on top of the other. Okay, so in this narration, three prohibitions. The ishtimal samma we have spoken about. The ihtiba in one clothing we have spoken about and given the exception to the case. Then we have the third rule here, the new one, lying on your back and putting one foot on top of the other. Why? Well, the illah, the justification, is the same as the illah for the ihtiba. It exposes your awra. Do not forget, they would wear the izar in those days. And underneath the izar, they would not be wearing anything. So if you sit in a position or lie down in a position which could expose your awra, then this is to be prohibited. But of course, if you're wearing a sirwal underneath the izar, then there is no prohibition. As for if both of your legs are stretched out, so lengthwise, and you put one foot over the other, then again there's no danger of your awra being exposed. The reason for the prohibition is that your awra is exposed. So the ihtiba and the istilqa, which is lying down on your back, these two prohibitions have a common factor or a common thread, which is that it exposes your awra. Like we said before, if you can guarantee that your awra is not exposed,
then there is no problem in that. Just some other points of benefit. Notice that the ring passed on to Abu Bakr, then on to Umar, then on to Uthman. And this proves that the prophets are not inherited from. Because if they were inherited, then of course Fatima should have inherited the ring. Okay, let's take some review questions at this stage. So question number 1. What hadith do we have which proves that you should not be purchasing unnecessary items, meaning excess things which you have no need for, so that you're purchasing them just for the sake of purchasing them? Question number 2. What is ishtimal samma and also what is al-ihtiba? And give the ruling on them both, with the justification for the ruling. Question number 3. Which fingers can men wear rings on?